What I'd like to do is just a few remarks here on what I think is a period of time of massive, I don't think it goes without saying, you didn't come all the way here to hear me, massive change. And there are three, and some people have heard me say this before, but my view, the world's going under massive change in the last 3 years based on 3 C's that have changed the world, and more importantly, the assumptions we all hold. COVID, conflict, and coercion. And those 3 C's have fundamentally upended the assumptions that we all held over the last 30 years. And I do believe that for the U.S.-Japan relationship, that has been defined in the past as one of alliance protection, is now in a new format, in a new era of alliance projection. And what we do, both the United States and Japan, and do together, will define in the next 3 years, will define the next 30 years and be foundational. But if you look across the globe, you look at the policies governments have taken, sometimes you think they're event-driven by what's happening in Ukraine with Russia's war, what's happening in the Middle East because of Gaza and Hamas, what Hamas has done to Israel. But if you go backwards, you can actually understand what the United States has done with the CHIP Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, the infrastructure bill, what Japan has done with deciding to increase the defense budget, acquire capabilities like counterstrike. All of those are a response in some way or another to the 3 C's: COVID, conflict, and coercion. And Japan, in many ways today, just take the issue of the coercion. You can see that happening out with how China's reacted to the water release at Fukushima. Not only banning the fish and the fish from the Japan waters, but continuing to fish those waters and acquire that fish. And they've tried to isolate Japan internationally. I think their actions, in my own humble opinion, have left China isolated, not Japan. And I'm proud that the United States military here in Japan has stood up next to our ally, and will continue to stand up for Japan as long as it takes to ensure that the end of this coercion. But if you go through the world, every country, every association is in some ways revising not only the assumptions, but the policies to deal with those 3 C's. No country, again, in the developed world, alliance world, will leave themselves vulnerable when it comes to supply chain. No country in the world will not, in some responsible way, if they're part of any relationship, not increase their defense and deterrence. Now, that is a reaction to what I say the 3 C's. But the world also is somewhat breaking down into, and I think when you look at what happened in Camp David, there are democracies who employ both defense, or what I call deterrence, and diplomacy, and there are revisionist powers that employ and deploy aggression and suppression. And I think one of the things that stood out in Camp David, having worked on this, yes, it was I think a fundamental strategic shift in the landscape of the Indo-Pacific, but more significantly than that, and one of the things I think sometimes gets lost, I think it goes without saying that the United States and Japan over the last 100 years have a complicated history. The United States and Korea have a complicated history. Korea and Japan have a complicated history. But the 3 leaders of the 3 countries decided that the future was more promising than the past, and used diplomacy and deterrence and dialogue to chart a course to the future. It doesn't come free of politics, we know that. But it stands, that deployment of diplomacy, dialogue, and deterrence stands in contrast to what you see happening in Ukraine with Russia's attack, based on a revisionist view of history, that Ukraine doesn't exist as a country, its people don't, which can explain certain decisions in the war to bomb civilians, to take over schools, to destroy libraries. that same revisionist mindset you can see in the way Hamas did to what it did to civilians, and also declare that Israel doesn't exist as a state. And so in that era where there's a revisionist power chasing 16th and 17th century versus others that look to the future, I think we offer more, both the United States, Japan, and Korea, where dialogue and diplomacy, not just as tactics, stand up in a period of darkness and stand in contrast, which is why it was so hopeful around the globe and not just constrained to this era and this area and this region. I think this is an opportunity to discuss going forward how we, building together and using what was done on Camp David in the trilateral Camp David principles to chart a different way. Well, this will be the first time for my life that a head of state has to listen to me first thing in the morning. Mr. Prime Minister, this idea. I've been trying to do that for years, working with President Obama and President Clinton. Now I finally get it, and I had to come all the way to Japan. So let me, given you're here to hear the Prime Minister, let me end here and pretty quickly before I make a mistake, which I'm prone to do. So let me say this as working here. The United States and Japan have a unique opportunity in this period of time. One of the things that I think is so important, and I'd lay out and following up from about Camp David. Right after Camp David, as Prime Minister Kishida, President Yoon were getting ready to depart with their delegations, we met with President Biden, and I say we, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, Tony Blinken, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, soon to be the Deputy Secretary of State Kurt Campbell, Mira, myself. And the President wanted to ensure that what we accomplished wasn't just a press conference, just wasn't a set of principles, but was embedded into the infrastructure of our national security and economic security. Since Camp David on August 18th, well over 15 different trilateral formats have happened, as recently in San Francisco, next week in Seoul, South Korea. It's happened on the military side, the diplomatic side, the intelligence side, the economic side, embedding into the infrastructure of all three countries a new format that I think fundamentally altered the strategic landscape of this region. And when we talk about a free and open Indo-Pacific, there is nothing more forceful than the three countries aligned, the #1 economy in the world, the #3 economy in the world, and the #9 economy in the world, not only in the sense of economic capacity, strategic capacity, but also the interest and the willingness to deploy it. And this weekend, the National Security Advisors to the three heads of state will be meeting in Seoul. It's one of the commitments made in August 18th at Camp David. But as equally significant in those interests will be what's happening here in Tokyo in 3 weeks. Japan, under the leadership of Prime Minister Kishida, will be hosting the 50th anniversary of the ASEAN Conference and the ASEAN Association. That, to me, is an example of what I call alliance projection, of ensuring the efforts of our collective interests are projected, and more than projected, are secured in the region. It was also under the Prime Minister that when you go back to March 2022, March 3rd, when we're coming up to the United Nations resolution condemning Russia's violation of the UN Charter and their invasion of Ukraine, that Japan got on the phone with all the ASEAN countries and secured 8 out of the 10 countries to support the resolution and 4 of them to co-sponsor. That is an example of alliance projection. And 2 weeks ago, when a boat off of Yemen was attacked, 2 countries' Navy responded to that call, SOS, the United States and Japan. Another country, China, owned 3 military boats, refused to heed the call of the SOS. Now, either you can have participation and ensure that with global leadership comes global responsibilities, or you can abdicate those responsibilities. And the United States and Japan stood shoulder to shoulder. So we are in the beginning era of charting what that new world is in a response not only to COVID, to conflict, and to coercion, ensuring our own economic, political, and strategic security, but doing it most importantly with our allies, not alone. And the strength of America in the Indo-Pacific, comes from the capability of having allies who will stand shoulder to shoulder. You can see that in the area of the Philippines and the South China Sea. You can see it in the trilateral meeting, not only in Camp David, but because all three countries also wrote national security documents that in many ways are overwhelmingly complementary and overlap each other. You can see it in the policy of AUKUS. You can see it in the way the Quad has coordinated. And you can see it in the way we have worked together with Japan as they make improvements and strengthening of their deterrence capabilities, how complementary that is to our overall objectives. That is just the last 2 years, not counting the fact, conclude on this, that in the United States and Japan, for the last 4 years, the United States has been the #1 foreign direct investor in Japan, and Japan has been the #1 foreign direct investor in the United States. It is on that basis, the shared values, shared interests, and shared vision that we're looking forward to the future. Conferences like this are essential as we chart that course. I'm going to end here because I can go on to healthcare if you would like, but that could be here through lunch, and I don't think that's a good idea. Thank you very much.